My mother's herbs once healed, but mine they poisoned. For 7 years, I weakened the man who was supposed to protect us, but became our monster. This is my true story. If you're listening anywhere in the world, comment where you are and subscribe, because some truths deserve to be heard. I was born in a small town where the hills smelled of pine and smoke, where neighbors called each other by name, and where remedies came from the soil long before they came from a pharmacy. My earliest memories are of my mother's hands, rough but steady, plucking leaves and roots with a precision that only years of practice could give. To outsiders, she was a folk healer. To me, she was simply Mama, who could stop a fever with willow bark tea or ease a cough with thyme and honey. She used to say, "Plants are like people. Some give life, others take it away. But most carry both powers inside them. It depends on how you use them." At the time, I thought it was only a lesson in respect. Later, I would realize it was also a warning. When I was little, I believed her hands could fix anything. A broken arm, a broken spirit, even a broken heart. I never imagined my own hands would one day betray her legacy, carrying out the kind of act she would never have condoned. And yet, I also know she would have understood, because it wasn't hatred that drove me. It was fear, and a mother's love so desperate it turned into something sharp, something lethal. I grew up poor, but not unhappy. We had little, but the land gave us enough to get by. Mama always said we carried our strength inside, and the earth gave us tools to bring it out. My childhood smelled of chamomile drying in bundles, of sage burning in the kitchen, of mint crushed between fingers. I thought that was the world. Safe, predictable, wholesome. But life has a way of twisting what you think you know. The herbs that once healed scraped knees and childhood coughs later became my silent weapons in a war I never asked to fight. I didn't choose the battlefield. It was my home. And the enemy wasn't a stranger. It was the man I married, the man I once believed would give me a safe life. Decades later, when I sit here as an old woman, I sometimes trace the lines of my palms and wonder, how could these same hands once stirred soup for my daughter, while stirring poison for my husband? The answer is simple and cruel. Because love is not always soft. Sometimes love grows claws. I tell you this not for pity. I don't want your pity. I want you to understand how a woman, trapped with no escape, found her own kind of justice in a world that offered her none. The first time I ever thought about poison, I wasn't planning murder. Murder felt final, irreversible, and I wasn't ready for that. What I wanted was time. Time to weaken him, so he could no longer raise those hands against us. Time to plan an escape. Time for my daughter to grow a little older, a little stronger. My intention was never to kill quickly. It was to erode, to strip him of the strength he used to terrify us. When I say this, some of you will feel uneasy. Some will say, "That's wrong. That's evil." But I ask you, what would you have done? In my time, there were no shelters, no hotlines, no laws that believed a wife's words over a husband's reputation. The police drank with the men who beat their wives. The priests told women to submit more, pray more, endure more. The neighbors closed their windows when they heard screams. So I did what I had to do. And that is why I start here with these hands, because they are the beginning and the end of everything I am about to tell you. Hands that learned to heal. Hands that learned to harm. Hands that carried both sin and salvation. This is not just a story of poison. It's a story of survival, of silence, of the hidden wars women fight behind closed doors. And as I tell it, remember this. Monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table. When I first met Arthur, I didn't see a monster. I saw stability. I saw safety. At least, that's what I told myself. I was only 18, fresh from a childhood where money was scarce, and the future seemed smaller than the valley I grew up in. Arthur was older, 12 years older to be exact. He had broad shoulders, gray already creeping into his hair, and a steady job at the factory. To a girl who had lost her mother young, who had been fending for herself, a man like that seemed like a promise. A home, a roof, a life without hunger. The courtship was fast. Too fast, I see now. He noticed me at the factory line, where I sorted peaches with other women. Unlike the boys my age, Arthur didn't giggle or stumble over words. He spoke with certainty. He bought me coffee, walked me home, opened doors for me. And when you've lived with emptiness, a small gesture feels like abundance. I remember the envy in the other girl's eyes when he started paying me attention. "Don't let this one go, Maggie," they whispered. "A man with a house of his own, with savings? That's a catch." At 18, I thought they were right. A man who could provide was the highest kind of love I could hope for. Our wedding was modest. Just a courthouse, a handful of witnesses, a simple dress I had sewn myself. I remember looking at him that day, in his pressed suit and polished shoes, and thinking I had chosen well. I imagined us growing old in that little house, raising children, planting herbs in the yard. The life I dreamed of was simple, and I thought he could give it to me. But shadows don't appear all at once. They creep. The first time Arthur lost his temper, we'd been married barely 6 months. He came home late, smelling of whiskey, his face flushed. I asked if he wanted dinner. That's all. He slammed his fist on the table so hard the dishes shook. "Are you keeping tabs on me now?" he shouted, eyes bloodshot. I froze, unable to understand what I had done wrong. And then, as quickly as the storm came, it was gone. The next morning, he kissed my forehead like nothing had happened. I told myself it was stress. Everyone said men carried the weight of the world. I believed them. That was how it worked. Weeks of peace. Then sudden rage over nothing. A shirt not ironed well enough, a neighbor who smiled at me, soup that was too cold. The outbursts were sharp and terrifying, but short-lived. He never hit me then. Just words, slammed doors, broken dishes. Enough to make me afraid, but not enough to convince me it was abuse. Back then, we didn't use that word. Women said, "He has a temper," or "That's just how men are." When I became pregnant with Catherine, I thought things would change. And for a while they did. Arthur seemed proud to become a father. He built a crib with his own hands, bragged at the factory about his new baby on the way. For a short season, I let myself believe we had turned a corner. But shadows don't lift easily. They only bide their time. After Catherine was born, sleepless nights and bills piled up. The old Arthur came back, only now louder, quicker to anger, less patient. He didn't hit me yet, but his words cut sharp. He belittled me, mocked my efforts, reminded me that everything we had was because of him. "Don't forget, girl," he would say. "I took you out of poverty. Without me, you'd have nothing." I began to learn the language of silence, the way to step lightly in my own house, to read his mood by the sound of his boots on the porch, to shrink myself small so he might not notice me. To the neighbors, we looked fine. To the church, we were respectable. To the factory, we were a normal family. But behind the door, shadows were stretching across my walls. And still I stayed. Not because I was blind, but because back then a woman had no real choice. Divorce was shame. Poverty was certain. And I believed, foolishly, that maybe love could still soften him. I didn't yet know that monsters grow strongest in silence. When Catherine was born, I thought light had entered my life again. She was tiny, wrinkled, with a cry that shook the room. But to me, she was proof that there was still something pure in this world. For a few years, that light seemed to push back the shadows. Arthur was calmer then. He bragged at work about being a father. He carried her proudly down the church aisle. He even built her toys from scraps of wood. For a while, I let myself believe that fatherhood had changed him. Maybe the man who shouted and slammed doors would fade away now that he had a daughter to love. But monsters don't disappear. They hide until the moment feels right. It began subtly. Catherine, once cheerful, started waking up at night screaming. At first, I thought it was nightmares. Then she started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was 4. Her teacher called me in one day, worried about her sudden silence in class. A child who once filled pages with colorful drawings was now sketching dark figures with heavy black lines pressed so hard the paper nearly tore. I tried to ask her what was wrong. "Is someone at school teasing you?" I asked gently, brushing her hair at night. She shook her head, avoiding my eyes. "Everything's fine, Mama." But her hands trembled as she spoke. Then I noticed how she acted around Arthur. Once, she used to run to the door when he came home, eager to show him her drawings. Now, she slipped quietly to her room, closing the door behind her. She never wanted to be alone with him. When he asked her questions, she answered softly, eyes cast down. That bond one thought they had, it was broken, replaced by fear she tried to hide. I didn't want to believe what my heart was already whispering. How could I? How could I admit that the man I had married, the father of my child, could be the very thing destroying her? The truth came not from her words, but from her drawings. One afternoon, while cleaning her room, I found a notebook shoved behind her dolls. I thought it was more of her art. Instead, I found pages filled with images no child should ever draw. A small figure curled in a corner, a large figure looming above, huge hands, tears, words scrawled in uneven letters. "Don't tell Mommy." My blood ran cold. My hand shook so hard I nearly dropped the notebook. Each page was a scream in silence, a confession she couldn't speak aloud. I wanted to deny it, to believe there was another explanation. But there wasn't. All the pieces fit. The nightmares, the fear, the distance, the drawings. My daughter was living in terror, and the monster was inside our own house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to Arthur's heavy breathing beside me, while Catherine clung to my side of the bed as if I were her only shield. And in truth, I was. Guilt crushed me like a weight. I thought of the nights I had slept while she was awake, trembling. Of the times she had tried to tell me in half words, through drawings and tears, and I hadn't understood. What kind of mother was I? But guilt soon hardened into something sharper. Rage. Cold, steady rage. I looked at Arthur sleeping there, the man the neighbors respected, the man who sat proudly at church, the man who dared to steal my daughter's safety. And in that moment, something in me broke. I understood that no priest, no policeman, no neighbor would save us. If I went to the authorities, they'd side with him. If I told the priest, he'd tell me to endure. If I told family, they'd say it was my burden. No. This was my battle. Mine alone. That night, while Catherine finally drifted into restless sleep, I made a promise in the dark. I would never let her suffer again. I would protect her, even if it meant crossing every line of right and wrong. And so, a seed was planted, the thought that if I couldn't leave the monster, then I would weaken him until he could no longer bite. The drawings had spoken for my daughter, and I, her mother, had heard them. I will never forget the night I made my vow. Catherine was asleep beside me, her small body pressed close, her breath uneven from crying. Arthur snored in the other room, oblivious, as if the world was his to command. And me? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside me shift forever. That night, guilt and rage braided together into a single thought. If the law won't protect her, I will. In my time, women had nowhere to turn. Divorce was scandal. Police were useless. Half of them drank with the same men who terrorized their families. Priests preached submission. Neighbors shut their windows when screams broke through thin walls. The world looked away. So I looked inward, to what my mother had left me, the knowledge of herbs. The next evening, after Arthur had gone to bed, I stepped outside into the backyard. The moon was almost full, bathing the garden in a pale light. My nightgown brushed against damp grass as I knelt by the plants. My hands trembled as I touched them, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. There was oleander, growing with deceptive beauty, its flowers pink and harmless to the eye. My mother had once warned me, "This one heals nothing. It only kills." I plucked a leaf. There was dumb cane, its broad leaves glistening with sap that burned skin if touched carelessly. I cut one carefully, folding it into cloth. There were castor bean leaves, bitter and metallic, which Mama had once said to keep children away from. I gathered them, too. I moved like a thief, though everything in that garden belonged to me. Every leaf, every root I pulled was a piece of my silent plan. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were of resolve, of knowing I was no longer the same woman who once thought patience and prayer could fix a man like Arthur. That woman had died the night I opened Catherine's notebook. In her place stood someone harder, colder. A mother who would do the unthinkable to shield her child. I remember whispering into the night, almost a prayer, but not to God, more to myself. He will never touch her again, not while I draw breath. I didn't plan to kill him outright. Death would have been too sudden, too suspicious. If Arthur died overnight, they'd point to me first. A wife is always the first suspect. And what would become of Catherine then? I couldn't risk it. No, my plan was slower, weaker, more patient. I would chip away at his strength like water carving stone. Enough to keep him from raising his hand, enough to keep him from creeping into her room. I dried the leaves in secret, ground them into powders so fine they looked like spices. I hid the vials among jars of flour and sugar, labeling them with false names. Every preparation was careful, measured. A mistake could expose me, or worse, end his life too soon. In the morning, I served him coffee as usual, my hands steady though my heart pounded. I had not yet added anything, but the decision had been made, and that was enough to change the air in the house. He drank, unaware that one day, that same cup would carry his undoing. That first night, I slept differently. Not peacefully, but with a grim kind of purpose. The kind that steels your back, sharpens your mind. When Catherine woke from another nightmare and crawled into my arms, I held her tighter than ever before. She didn't know yet, but I had declared war. A silent war. A mother's war. And in the shadows of my kitchen, my weapons were already waiting. The morning I finally crossed the line felt almost ordinary. Arthur sat at the kitchen table, reading the paper, the smell of strong coffee filling the air. Catherine was still asleep in her room, curled under her blanket. To anyone passing by, we were just another family starting another day. But inside my pocket was a vial of powder I had ground from oleander leaves the night before. My hands looked calm as I poured coffee into his cup, but inside, my heart hammered so loud I thought he might hear it. I pinched just enough powder between my fingers, no more than a sprinkle, and stirred until it vanished into the dark liquid. Arthur looked up, suspicious for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're quiet this morning," he said. "Didn't sleep well?" I replied, sliding the cup toward him. My voice was steady, but inside I was screaming. I watched as he lifted the cup, sipped, and went on reading. To him, it was nothing. To me, it was everything. That single sip marked the beginning of a war he didn't even know he was fighting. The first days, nothing happened. That was the plan. Too much would kill him outright. Too little, and he'd never feel a thing. I needed the balance, a sickness that looked natural, gradual, undetectable. By the second week, I noticed small changes. He came home more tired than usual, complaining of headaches. He blamed the factory noise, the stress. I only nodded, refilling his cup each morning. Inside, I felt a flicker of triumph. Not joy, not relief, just the grim satisfaction of knowing the poison was working. At night, while he lay in bed groaning softly, I pretended to fuss over him like a caring wife. I brewed teas, tucked blankets around him, asked about his day. To anyone looking, I was devoted. But inside, I was cataloging every symptom, measuring progress like a doctor studying a patient. Still, I never touched Catherine's food with so much as a grain of powder. I prepared her meals separately, carefully, like a surgeon sterilizing instruments. If my war was to protect her, then she had to remain untouched by it. That was my line, and I would never cross it. The more he weakened, the less power he had. He still barked orders, still raised his voice, but the blows of his words no longer landed as hard. His steps grew unsteady, his arms less firm. The man who once filled the house with a storming presence was beginning to stumble in his own shadow. I remember the first night, I felt a sliver of peace. He had come home, slamming the door, his face red with anger over something at the factory. My stomach clenched, waiting for the usual rage. But halfway through his rant, he grew pale, clutching his stomach. He sat down heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. Catherine slipped into her room quietly, eyes wide, but for once, he didn't follow. He sat there, shaking, too weak to do anything more than complain about bad food at work. That night, he fell asleep snoring, drenched in sweat. Catherine crept into my room, trembling. I held her tight, whispering, "It's all right, baby. He won't hurt you tonight." And for the first time, those words felt almost true. From then on, the poison became part of our daily rhythm. A sprinkle in the coffee, a drop in the stew, a trace hidden under the spice of cumin or pepper. He never suspected. And why would he? No one ever suspects the devoted wife. But I knew one thing clearly. This wasn't victory. Not yet. It was only the first move in a long game of survival. As I lay in bed beside him, listening to his labored breathing, I thought of my mother's words. Plants are like people. Some heal, some kill, some do both. And now, so did I. By the time Arthur's strength began to slip, I knew poison alone wasn't enough. He was weaker, yes. His hands trembled, his voice cracked. But a sick man can still be dangerous. A father with dark urges doesn't need full strength to harm a child. So I created another layer of protection, one made of whispers, signals, and secret codes that only Catherine and I understood. We started small. At first, it was just a phrase. If I said, "It's a beautiful day today," Catherine knew to stay close to me, never out of reach. If I said, "Tomorrow I'll bake a cake," she knew it meant danger was brewing, and she should sleep at her friend's house if possible. Later, we added gestures. If I put the pressure cooker on the stove and let the hiss echo through the house, it was our alarm. If I left the broom leaning against her door, it meant she should lock it and not come out for any reason. We practiced these things the way other families practice prayers. Quietly, deliberately, until they became second nature. One night, as we folded laundry together, I told her, "If he ever corners you, run to the tool shed. Lock yourself in. Say you're looking for something you lost." She looked up at me with those wide eyes that had already seen too much for her age. She nodded. No fear in her face, just a calm acceptance, like a soldier learning battle drills. It broke me to teach her this. A child should learn songs and games, not survival codes. But Catherine didn't complain. She memorized every signal, repeated them back to me with solemn determination. We were partners in this secret war. Sometimes she tested the codes, whispering them back to me before bed. Beautiful day means stay with you. Cake means go to a friend's house. Broom at the door means don't come out. I'd nod, kiss her forehead, and remind her. Thieves protect each other. And we are thick as thieves, you and I. At school, she grew quieter but sharper. Her teachers thought she was shy. I knew she was watching, listening, always alert. Trauma sharpens a child's instincts like a blade. She could read the sound of Arthur's footsteps better than I could. She knew the difference between his angry gait and his tired shuffle. Sometimes she warned me before I even noticed. Our lives became a pattern of silent signals layered over ordinary routines. Breakfast, school, dinner, bedtime, all normal on the surface. Underneath, a constant undercurrent of coded messages and hidden defenses. I also taught her to scream. Not the timid cries of a child, but a loud, piercing scream that could rattle walls. We practiced it when Arthur wasn't home. She would scream, and I would time how long it took me to reach her. She thought of it as a game. I knew it might one day save her life. Mrs. Patricia, our neighbor, noticed more than she let on. She had lived long enough to recognize the hush of a household hiding something. Sometimes, she called Catherine over for milk and cookies right when Arthur came home in a foul mood. She never said why, but her eyes met mine across the fence, and I knew she was part of our silent network, a silent ally in our battle. Looking back, I realized Catherine was never truly a child. The day she learned the codes was the day she traded innocence for survival. Yet she carried it with strength far beyond her years. I often wondered if I was giving her weapons or taking away her childhood. Maybe both. But I knew one truth. Every signal, every code, was one more chance to keep her safe. And for me, safety was worth any sacrifice, even her innocence. Because while the poison worked slowly in his veins, our signals worked instantly in our hearts. Together, we built a shield of silence strong enough to hold back a monster. Sometimes help doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with a knock, a warm plate, and eyes that say, "I see you." Mrs. Patricia lived on the other side of our thin fence. She was a widow, small and sturdy, with hands that always smelled faintly of soap. She had a way of reading a house without stepping inside. She knew when the curtains changed, when the radio got louder, when a woman's smile grew tight around the edges. I never told her our secret. I didn't have to. Women like her learn to hear what isn't spoken. It started with small kindnesses. On evenings when Arthur's boots hit the porch harder than usual, her kitchen window would open. "Catherine, honey, I baked too much," she'd call. "Come taste and tell me if it's any good." A child can't refuse pie. Neither can a mother who needs a minute to breathe. When laundry dried between our yards, she used the clothesline like a telegraph. If a storm of mood gathered on my side, she clipped a red clothespin to the rope. If things were calm, she used a plain wooden one. It was our first shared code. We never discussed it. We just used it. On Saturdays, she claimed she needed help reading letters. "Old eyes," she'd say with a smile. Catherine would go sit at her small table, where the kettle always sang and a radio hummed soft songs. Sometimes she stayed until after dark. On those nights, I slept a little easier. There were days when she simply stood by the fence and talked about nothing. Peonies, prices at the market, the weather coming in from the river. But while she talked, she watched the house. If Arthur came home early, she found a reason to keep Catherine by her side. If I had to step out, she kept her kitchen light on like a lighthouse beam. Once, she knocked in the middle of a rainstorm. "I made something strong for sleep," she whispered, handing me a brown bottle wrapped in a towel. "From my Mother's Day. It helps nerves settle." I didn't ask what was in it. She didn't explain. We understood each other's need for mercy that didn't require a confession. Another time, when pay was short and the bills were tall, she pressed an envelope into my palm. "For Catherine's school books," she murmured. There were a few small bills inside, and a bus timetable folded neat. I looked up, startled. She met my eyes and said softly, "You don't owe me a story. I owe you a door." Help also came as delay. On a gray afternoon, the factory sent me home early. Arthur might have been close behind. Mrs. Patricia saw me from her window and moved like she had a plan. She met him at the gate before he reached our steps. "Can you carry this sack for me?" she asked, pointing to groceries that seemed heavier than they looked. He huffed, but he lifted. 10 minutes later, Catherine was safe next door, and I had changed the air in our kitchen from fear to plain. Not all her help was gentle. Sometimes her voice held steel. Once, after Catherine left her house, she lingered at the fence and said, almost to the air, "I used to sleep with a chair against the door, too." She didn't look at me when she said it. I didn't speak. But the truth sat between us like a shared code in winter. Little by little, the fence between our houses turned into a line of defense. 2 women, 2 kitchens, 1 quiet alliance. She never asked for details. I never gave them. But when the night pressed hard against our windows, I knew there was another window lit just for us. Kindness can be a kind of resistance. In a world that tells women to hush, kindness says, "I will not look away." It buys time. It creates space. It lets a child laugh in another room while danger paces in this one. Catherine blossomed under that small shelter. She learned how to sew a crooked hem at Mrs. Patricia's table. She tasted soups and practiced her loudest laugh. She heard an adult woman say, "You are safe here," and believed it. That is a kind of medicine no bottle can hold. I don't know if Mrs. Patricia ever guessed the full truth about our house. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't need to. What she knew was enough. A mother and a daughter were fighting a quiet war, and she would stand watch. As months turned into years, Arthur's storms came less with thunder and more with gray drizzle. He was still dangerous, but his shadow had thinned. In that slow change, our neighbor's steady light mattered. It reminded me that even silent wars can have allies. By the time the leaves turned brittle and fell, the balance inside our walls had shifted. The monster still breathed, but his voice carried less power. And somewhere between the fence and the kitchen table, between a pie and a red clothespin, our courage learned to stand a little taller. Next came the wearing down, the long season when his strength drained and our breath returned. But battles rarely end cleanly. Some end in a stumble, a fall, a moment no one can ever take back. The change didn't come like thunder. It came like rust. Quiet, patient, always working. By the end of that first year, Arthur moved slower. He came home and sank into the chair like an old man, even though he wasn't one. His hands shook when he tied his laces. He rubbed his chest without noticing. He blamed age, then stress, then bad food at the factory. I nodded, set plates on the table, and watched the storm inside him lose wind. Doctors saw him often and understood him rarely. One said nerves. Another said stomach. A third said he should rest and avoid heavy meals. He came home with bottles and advice he never followed. None of them found a clear cause. How could they? They were searching for a single answer to 1,000 small falls. What mattered to me wasn't the names they gave his problems. What mattered was the result. Nights that used to terrify us became quiet. He still barked, but the bite was gone. He still tried to loom, but his shadow had shrunk. I tucked Catherine in and felt, for the first time in years, that she could sleep. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough. Guilt visited me in the dark, regular as a clock. It sat at the end of my bed and asked the same question. What sort of woman are you now? I never had a clean answer. I only had a purpose. I wasn't after revenge. I was after space. Enough space for my girl to grow without fear. If there was sin in that, then I would carry it. Not on Catherine's back. On mine. Our code stayed in place. The kettle still whistled warnings. The broom still leaned against doors. But we needed them less. Catherine learned to read his new weakness as easily as she once read danger. She kept distance without looking afraid. She spoke up in small ways. She laughed sometimes, really laughed, careful at first, then freer. Money gathered slowly in the hiding place only I knew. Coins. Crumpled notes. A small pile that looked like breath. I told myself that when it was enough, we would leave for good. Boston maybe. A fresh start. But goals move when life moves. Each month I told myself, one more. Just one more month to be safer, stronger, ready. Arthur changed in other ways too. Anger gave way to something heavier, shame, maybe. He used to measure himself by strength. When strength left him, he measured himself by nothing. He stared at walls longer. He slept through afternoons. Sometimes I heard him cry out in his dreams like a child does, lost and afraid. I didn't wake him. Mercy can be many things. Mine was distance. To others, I was the devoted wife. The neighbor who fetched his pills, who stood straight at clinic counters, who said, "Thank you, doctor," with tired eyes. I wore a calm face like a uniform. People praised it. If they only knew what uniforms can hide. Mrs. Patricia kept watch from her kitchen light. A pie on a bad day. A wave through the fence when she saw our curtains drawn. She didn't ask for the story behind our house. She respected the door that didn't open. Some people rescue with answers. She rescued with presence. Seasons turned. Leaves browned. Snow came and learned our steps. Spring returned and found us still standing. The years did what years do. They softened edges, wore grooves, made habits. Catherine grew taller. Her shoulders set back. She stopped flinching at sudden sounds. She drew in color again. The kind of small miracles no one claps for, but mothers notice. I wish I could tell you that I felt triumph. I didn't. I felt exhaustion with a ribbon of relief running through it. Every day still carried risk. Every meal still carried a secret. Every breath had the taste of being found out. I learned that survival isn't a victory march. It's steady feet on a narrow path. Sometimes Arthur would study me with a long, searching look, as if trying to solve a riddle only he could hear. "You've changed," he'd say. "We all do," I'd answer, and clear the table before my hands could give me away. The body keeps score. His did. One summer he fainted at work and was moved to a lighter desk job. At home he shuffled more than he walked. Door frames caught his shoulders. He slept through sermons at church. The man who once filled rooms now seemed smaller than his chair. People whispered illnesses they didn't understand. I kept my eyes low and my face plain. By then, I had begun to believe we might reach the finish line I imagined. A quiet departure, a new city, years between us and him. I forgot the first rule of living under threat: never relax near the end. That's when carelessness visits. That's when a single loose board can speak louder than all your silence. I thought time was my ally. I thought secrecy would hold. I was wrong. Secrets don't shout when they end. They click like a lock turning from the other side. It was a humid afternoon, the kind that makes the air feel heavy. The factory sent me home early. Catherine was still at school for rehearsal. I thought I had hours to work in quiet, enough time to grind, measure, label, and tuck everything away again. I cut across the yard to the back shed, the place where our silence lived behind loose boards. Before my hand reached the latch, I felt it. The wrongness. The door stood barely ajar. A breath of air moved from inside to out, carrying the sweet bitter scent of dried leaves that should have stayed hidden. Arthur was there, standing, cane in one hand, one of my small brown vials in the other. The boards I used to cover the cavity lay on the floor, nails still clinging like teeth. He looked smaller than he used to, yet in that moment he filled the room. "So," he said, voice like gravel, "this is what's been killing me by inches." I didn't answer. There are no safe words for a truth like that. He turned the vial, reading the label I'd written in a careful hand, false names that meant everything to me and nothing to anyone else. Seasoning. Sleep blend. Tonic. The glass trembled between his fingers. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been doing this to me? In my own house?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a fuse. "Long enough," I said quietly. "Long enough to keep our daughter safe." The word daughter hit him harder than any confession. His face stiffened, eyes narrowing. For a heartbeat, I saw not illness or weakness, but the old Arthur. the one who ruled rooms by looking at them. You will not put that on me, he hissed, stepping forward. She lies. You always were soft, easy to bend. And now you've poisoned me with stories and powders. He flung the vial at the wall. It burst with a small, vicious sound, spraying shards and the thin ghost of its contents across the boards. He lifted the cane. I backed up until the workbench pressed cold against my legs. There's a moment, when fear crests, that the world becomes very clear. My eyes mapped the room, the hoe propped in the corner, the bucket by the door, the gap where the boards had been. His steps dragged, but his anger moved fast. The cane came down. I dodged, the tip cracking against the bench, splintering wood. He swung again, clumsier this time, but with the weight of years behind it. The second blow caught my shoulder, not a break, but a warning from bone. Breath rushed from me. The shed seemed to close in, walls leaning. Dust lifted and hung in the damp light. 7 years, he panted, lining up another strike. 7 minutes is all I need. I braced for the next hit. It didn't land. The door banged open, hard enough to rattle the hinges. Catherine stood there, rain-damp hair stuck to her forehead, a length of broken fence slat clutched in both hands. The look on her face was not a child's. It was steady, fierce, and very, very alive. "Leave her," she said. Not a shout. Something sharper. Arthur turned, cane still raised. He tried to gather himself into the man he used to be, the one she feared. But even monsters have physics to obey. He was slow. She was not. He stepped toward her. She didn't give ground. When he closed the distance, she moved, one clean swing, not at his head, not at his chest, but low, where balance lives. The wood met bone with a crack that ended the argument. He buckled, came clattering away. A sound escaped him. Part rage, part pain, part stunned realization that the world no longer bent when he leaned on it. I reached Catherine, pulled her behind me, breath tearing in my throat. He tried to rise. The leg refused. He reached for the bench, missed, and dropped back with a thud that shook dust from the rafters. His face had gone a color I'd only seen in winter skies. For a moment, no one spoke. Rain threaded the doorway. A single bottle rolled in a slow circle on the floor and came to rest. "Look at me," I told Catherine, my voice steadier than my hands. "Breathe." She did. In, out. The slat loosened in her grip. Arthur's chest heaved. He pressed a hand to it, eyes unfocused, jaw clenched against a pain that lived deeper than the leg. The breath in the shed turned thin. I could hear his heartbeat in the silence, the heavy, arrhythmic pound of a body that had been losing a long fight and had just been given another. This was the precipice, the place where choices write themselves in permanent ink. One move would mark us forever. I looked at my daughter, not at the man on the floor. Some endings are about who you refuse to become. "Catherine," I said, "listen to me." She nodded, ready for whatever came next. And then the sound in Arthur's chest changed. Cliffhanger. The sound in his chest changed, like a door slamming somewhere deep inside him. His eyes widened, then slipped out of focus. The hand on his cane went slack. For a heartbeat, the shed held its breath with him. He tried to speak and couldn't. A dry rasp came out instead. His mouth worked around a word he never finished. Then his body folded, slow at first, then all at once, knee to dirt, shoulder to floor, the breath knocked clean out of him. I felt Catherine tense beside me, the board still in her hands. Her face was set like stone, but her knuckles were white. This was the edge. I could feel the question standing between us. Do we let the monster end here? I looked at her, not at him, and chose. "Catherine," I said, voice steady. "Go to the payphone. Call for an ambulance. Tell them it's his heart. Then come straight back." She stared at me, searching my face for something. Permission, absolution, a different answer. I gave her neither. I gave her a path. After a tight breath, she ran. The shed door swung wide, letting in a wet ribbon of daylight and the faint sound of her footsteps tearing down the alley. I turned to the man on the ground. His chest hitched in shallow bursts. The skin around his mouth had gone the color of chalk. His eyes fluttered, present, then far away. I rolled him enough that he wouldn't choke, pressed a rough jacket under his head, and listened for the rhythm that tells you if a person means to stay. It was there, but wrong. A stagger. A stutter. A drum beaten with broken sticks. You might think I prayed. I didn't. I measured. I counted breaths, counted seconds, counted the distance between the life we'd have if he died and the life we'd have if he lived. And then I saw Catherine in my mind, the girl with the drawings turned young woman with a plank in her hands, and I knew the choice I'd already made. I would not let her victory be rewritten as killing. Not by him. Not by gossip. Not by time. Not like this, I whispered. You don't get to write our ending. The minutes grew long and elastic. Rain thickened. Somewhere far off, a siren began as a thread of sound and pulled closer, pulling the world with it. I kept watching his chest, kept listening for the stagger, kept the cold from his throat with my hands. He drifted in and out, eyes glassy, lips bluing at the corners. The shed smelled of damp wood and the bitter ghost of shattered herbs. The ambulance light washed the yard in red, then white, then red again. Boots on mud, quick voices. Questions I answered simply, face arranged into the mask I had learned years ago. The wife who copes. They lifted him with practiced arms, strapped him against the gurney's narrow mercy, and the world moved fast again. Doors, metal, the slam that ends the waiting. Hospitals are made of humming. Machines hum, lights hum, people hum inside themselves to keep from breaking. Catherine found me in that hum, wet hair clinging to her cheeks, breathing hard. I took her hand. We sat like that, 2 points on a line that had just bent forever. Doctors came in shifts. Words came in clusters. Cardiac event, oxygen, neurological risk, critical window. I nodded, as if my nod could anchor anything. Hours folded into one another until a man with kind eyes stood still in front of us and said the thing we would carry. He's alive, he told us. But there's significant brain involvement. We don't know how much he understands. He may not speak. He may not move on his own. This could be permanent. Alive. Permanent. 2 words with a canyon between them. They let us see him after. Tubes nested where sentences used to live. Monitors wrote unreadable poems in green. His eyes were open, but they did not land. He looked past me, through me, beyond the ceiling, like a man staring into weather only he could see. I felt nothing noble standing there. No triumph. No mercy. Just the quiet understanding that the war had ended and left a kind of wreckage no one could display in a window. Catherine squeezed my fingers. Is this over? She asked, voice small, woman and child at once. It's different, I said. Different is what we can live with. We walked out into the evening, which had the nerve to be ordinary. Cars, puddles, a bus sighing at the curb. Somewhere far behind us, a machine kept time for the man who had kept time for our fear. He would go on breathing. He would go on being alive. But the part of him that ruled rooms was gone, and the doors he used as weapons were now closed to him for good. I had not let him die. Not because he deserved breath, but because my daughter deserved a life unshadowed by the word killer. Justice sometimes looks like a body that keeps living without power. He survived. And in that survival, a new prison opened, one he'd never walk out of, and one we finally could. They called it a long-term care facility. To me, it looked like time with white walls. The halls smelled like antiseptic and lemon, the lights always a little too bright, the clocks a little too loud. Arthur lay in a narrow bed by a window that never opened. Machines breathed the slow grammar of his days. Beep, pause, beep, sentences without verbs. He was awake, in the technical sense. His eyes opened. Sometimes they wandered. Once in a while they found a shape and stayed there, as if trying to remember what looking meant. But the man who filled our house with storms had been reduced to weather. If he knew us, it flickered and vanished before it reached the surface. A nurse showed me the chart. Words like nonverbal, total care, dependent. I signed papers with a hand that didn't shake, then went to the parking lot and sat in the car until evening. I didn't cry. Some deserts are too dry for tears. People asked if I would bring him home. "He's your husband," they'd say, as if the word itself were a map. I shook my head. I worked. I had a daughter finishing school. Our home had 4 rooms and only 2 hands to manage them. The clinic had staff, lifts, rails, routines. And it had something else we needed: distance. At first, I visited every day. Habit is a heavy coat. It takes time to slip out of it. I carried small things: lotion for dry hands, a radio tuned to his old station, a blanket with weight, so he could feel grounded. The nurses were kind in the practical way of people who have seen everything. They called me dear and showed me how to smooth sheets so skin wouldn't break. I learned the new language of him: the flutter that meant discomfort, the long stare that meant nothing at all, the sudden tightness in his breath that sent alarms into the hallway. I spoke out loud while I adjusted the radio, not because I believed he understood, but because silence felt like surrender. And yet, when I left and pulled the door shut, I felt the world expand around me like a room finally aired. I walked to the bus stop without checking shadows. I cooked dinner without listening for a key in the lock. Catherine slept through the night and woke up hungry. Freedom didn't arrive like a parade. It arrived like a series of ordinary afternoons. Money was thin, but it held. I kept my job and took in sewing at night. Catherine studied at the kitchen table, pencil tapping a steady beat. We marked time by report cards, not by tempers. She started laughing the way young people do, sudden, careless, as if joy could outrun anything. The first time I heard it, I stood in the doorway and let the sound fill the house like sunlight. We visited the clinic on Sundays. She brought a book. I brought patience. Sometimes she read aloud just to hear her own voice float over the machines. Sometimes she sat, hands folded, eyes somewhere past the window. Once, on our way out, she asked, "Does he know?" "Maybe," I said. "Maybe not." I didn't add the rest. That knowing would change nothing. A prison is a prison whether you understand the bars or not. When Catherine finished high school, a guidance counselor said the word scholarship, and a door opened I had only dared to imagine. Boston. A room in a cousin's flat. Classes that started before the day had a chance to turn heavy. I packed her clothes in a suitcase that once held fear and now held hope. At the bus station, she hugged me and said, "We made it this far." I nodded. We had. Alone in the house, I moved furniture, then my life. I sold the old place and rented a small apartment close to work. I took the sewing machine out of the corner and put it in the window. Dresses began to hang from door frames like small flags of progress. Neighbors came with hems and left with stories. I did not tell mine. I didn't need to. It had already done its work. Years do what years do. They sand sharp edges. They make the unthinkable into something you can think about without breaking. I visited the clinic less often. Monthly was enough. On those days, I walked the same bright hallway, pressed the same button for the elevator, and sat in the same chair. I spoke about Catherine's classes, the weather, the price of peaches. He blinked. Once, I thought I saw a shimmer of recognition. It might have been the reflection of the window. 10 years is a long sentence. He served it without trial, locked in the body he used as a weapon. Some will say that wasn't justice. Maybe not in books. But in a small kitchen where a girl once learned to sleep with a chair against her door, it was something like balance. He lived. We lived better. When the call finally came, a nurse with a tired voice, A morning like any other, I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the light creep across the floorboards. "He didn't suffer," she said. I thanked her for telling me. I made tea. I stood at the sink and let the kettle's steam touch my face. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel grief. I felt a quiet that had weight to it, the kind that settles after a storm has moved out to sea. What comes after a war is not fireworks. It is rebuilding. It is teaching your hands to make again what they once learned to undo. It is telling a girl she is safe, then proving it across years, so the message reaches every room inside her. That began for us long before the phone call. But the call sealed it. The past couldn't reach forward anymore. The rest, how a woman becomes more than what she survived, how a family grows taller than its shadow, belongs to the closing chapter. In the quiet of this room, I watch the river move like a long silver ribbon. It carries leaves, light, and the proof that nothing stands still forever. I am an old woman now, but I know this much. Survival is not the end of a story. It is the start of the part that matters, what you build after. For years, I thought strength meant holding your breath and bearing it. Now I know different. Real strength is the moment you say, enough, and mean it. A boundary is a line, yes, but it is also a door. You close it to harm and open it to a better life. After the clinic, after the papers, after the house was sold and the old ghosts thinned, I began to practice small boundaries in ordinary ways. I said no to people who spoke to me like I was less. I said yes to sleep, to food hot from the pan, to walks that went nowhere except back to myself. I kept my sewing machine by the window and let sunlight stitch my days together. Women started to appear at my door. First a client with a bruise hidden under makeup, then a neighbor with a quiet voice, then a stranger who had heard I might understand. I did not have a grand plan. I had a kettle, a couch, and a rule. No one tells you who you are in this room. They came tired and left with numbers, safe addresses, and the feeling that someone believed them. Sometimes belief is the strongest medicine. Catherine built a life that would have made my mother cry from pride. She teaches little ones how to read, yes, but more than that, she teaches them how to speak up, how to ask for help, how to trust their own alarms. She sets clear lines and bright paths. I used to fear that our past would make her hard. It didn't. It made her precise. She knows where safety lives and she leads others there. And Lucy, my granddaughter with the fierce eyes and quick laugh, asks questions I never had the language to ask. She wants to change systems, not just stories. She says, "Grandma, love is rules, not cages." I nod. Boundaries are love's rules. They keep love clean. Sometimes Lucy asks about her grandfather. We keep it simple. We say he was unwell and that we chose safety. What matters is what she sees, a mother and grandmother who did not let the dark decide the future. She grew up with locked doors that meant care, not fear. She knows a boundary is not a wall against joy. It is the frame that holds joy up. People wonder if I feel guilt. I feel many things, but I do not feel lost in them. I carry them in a small basket that I can set down when I need to rest. I did not choose the war. I chose the shield. If there is judgment left in the world, it is lighter than my granddaughter's laughter, and I let the wind take it. When I speak to younger women now, I do not talk first about poison or plans. I talk about signs. I talk about money with your own name on it. I talk about a friend who will answer at midnight. I talk about copies of documents, shoes by the door, and a spare key with someone you trust. These are not dramatic things. They are practical doors to freedom. If you take nothing else from my story, take this: you are not weak for drawing lines. You are wise. You are not difficult for saying no. You are clear. You are not broken because someone hurt you. You are healing. And healing is a kind of courage the world rarely sees because it happens in kitchens, on buses, at small desks late at night. The river outside keeps moving. So do we. My hands that once shook now rest. They have done enough. They have learned another craft, releasing what is finished, blessing what remains. If you're listening, tell me where you are watching from, and tell me one boundary you promise yourself from today. If stories of quiet courage matter to you, subscribe. We tell them gently here, not to reopen wounds, but to remind you that forward is possible and that the light you carry is already brighter than the rooms you had to survive. This was not a story of poison, not really. It was a story of a line drawn for a child and a life rebuilt on the safe side of that line.